There's an 8-stage collapse formula that has toppled every great empire in the last 2,000 years. And right now, in 2025, the United States has completed 7 of those 8 stages. Not 6, not 5, 7. We're not approaching imperial collapse. We're already deep inside the final sequence, and the math says stage 8 is coming faster than anyone wants to admit. Rome took 4 centuries to complete all 8 stages. The British Empire completed them in 40 years. The Soviet Union blazed through them in just 26 years from peak to total dissolution. Each time, the people in power never saw it coming. Each time, they believed their empire was different, special, too big to fail. Each time, they were catastrophically wrong. Because the formula doesn't care about exceptionalism. The formula is mathematical, it's predictable, and it's happening again. In 753 BC, Rome was a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. By 117 AD, it controlled 3 million square miles and 60 million people. The greatest military machine ever assembled, roads that connected 3 continents, architecture that still stands today, a legal system that forms the foundation of modern law. For over 400 years, Rome seemed eternal, unshakable, destined to rule forever. Then came Stage 1. Stage 1 is always military overextension. The empire grows beyond its ability to defend itself effectively. Rome's borders stretched from Scotland to Sudan, from Portugal to Persia, 4,300 miles of frontier that required constant defence. Legions stationed in Germany couldn't respond to threats in Egypt. Forces in Britain couldn't assist campaigns in Mesopotamia. The military was spread so thin that every border became vulnerable. But here's what most people don't understand about military overextension. It's not just about geography, it's about economics. Each legion cost roughly 1 million denarii annually to maintain. Equipment, wages, supplies, infrastructure. By the 3rd century, Rome was maintaining 30 legions plus auxiliary forces, 30 million denarii per year just for basic military operations. That's before counting fortifications, roads, naval forces, or veteran benefits. The military budget consumed 60% of imperial revenue, 60%, and it still wasn't enough to secure the borders. Stage 2 always follows Stage 1, currency debasement. When military costs exceed revenue, governments face a choice: raise taxes and risk rebellion, cut spending and risk invasion, or debase the currency and steal wealth invisibly from citizens. Rome chose debasement. For the first 2 centuries of empire, the denarius contained 95% pure silver. It was real money, backed by precious metal, trusted across 3 continents. Then Emperor Nero began the process that would destroy Roman civilization. Nero reduced silver content to 85%. Still mostly silver, still trusted, but 10% less valuable than before. Citizens noticed their coins looked different, but didn't understand the implications. Trajan pushed it to 75%. Marcus Aurelius dropped it to 60%. Each emperor thinking they could solve fiscal problems by creating money from nothing. By the time of Emperor Gallienus, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. What had been a silver coin became bronze with silver plating that wore off within months of circulation. The results were predictable and catastrophic. Prices exploded as merchants realized the coins were worthless. A measure of wheat that cost 1 denarius under Augustus cost 50 denarii under Marcus Aurelius. The same measure cost 2,000 denarii under Diocletian. Inflation didn't just rise, it accelerated exponentially. From less than 1% annually in the 1st century to 35% annually by the 4th century. Citizens who had saved money for decades watched their wealth evaporate. The middle class, the backbone of Roman society, was financially destroyed. Stage 3 is debt spiral. When currency debasement fails to solve fiscal problems, borrowing accelerates. Rome borrowed from wealthy senators, from provincial governors, from client kingdoms, from anyone willing to lend. Interest payments consumed increasing portions of revenue. More borrowing was needed to service existing debt. The spiral became self-perpetuating and mathematically impossible to escape. But debt spiral creates a secondary problem that historians often miss: brain drain. The wealthy and educated, the people who should be solving problems, start leaving. They move their assets to safer territories. Roman elites began relocating to Constantinople, to Alexandria, to territories beyond imperial control. Capital flight accelerated as confidence collapsed. The empire was left with consumers but not producers. bureaucrats but not innovators, soldiers but not taxpayers. Stage 4 is loss of productive capacity. This is where the collapse becomes visible to ordinary citizens. Industries shut down because importing goods becomes cheaper than manufacturing them. Roman workshops that had produced pottery, metalwork, textiles for centuries couldn't compete with imports from Gaul, Germania, or beyond the borders. Why maintain expensive Roman production when barbarian goods cost half the price? Agricultural production declined as small farmers abandoned their land. Heavy taxation made farming unprofitable. Constant warfare disrupted planting and harvesting cycles. Rural populations fled to cities seeking protection and government benefits, but cities don't produce food, they consume it. As rural production collapsed, food shortages became chronic. Rome, which had once fed 60 million people across the empire, couldn't reliably feed the million residents of the capital city. Stage 5 is social decay. This is when the symptoms become impossible to ignore. Crime explodes as economic desperation spreads. Political violence becomes routine as different factions compete for control of dwindling resources. Public infrastructure crumbles because there's no money for maintenance. Aqueducts leak. Roads develop potholes that never get repaired. Public buildings fall into disrepair. But the most dangerous aspect of Stage 5 is the loss of civic virtue. Citizens stop believing in the empire's mission. Military service, once an honour, becomes something to avoid. Tax compliance becomes optional as people lose faith in government competence. Corruption spreads through every level of administration. Officials stop serving the public interest and start serving themselves. The social contract that held Roman civilization together for centuries disintegrated within a generation. Stage 6 is military collapse. This happens faster than anyone expects because it's not just about losing battles, it's about losing the will to fight. Roman legions that had conquered the known world began refusing orders. Units mutinied when wages weren't paid. Soldiers deserted rather than marched to distant frontiers. Entire provinces were abandoned because there weren't enough reliable troops to defend them. Foreign mercenaries were hired to fill the gaps, but mercenaries fight for money, not loyalty. When Rome couldn't pay them, they switched sides or became bandits. Gothic mercenaries who had been defending Roman territory began raiding it instead. The military that had created the empire became the force that destroyed it. Stage 7 is political fragmentation. The empire splits as regional commanders refuse to recognize central authority. In Rome's case, this happened multiple times. The crisis of the 3rd century saw 50 emperors in 50 years, most dying violent deaths. The empire temporarily split into 3 separate states. Even when reunified, the division between East and West became permanent. What had been one empire became 2, then multiple competing kingdoms. But here's what should terrify you about Stage 7. It happens suddenly, not gradually over decades, but rapidly within a few years. Political authority that seemed absolute collapses almost overnight. Citizens who thought their government was eternal watch. It splintered into competing factions that wage war against each other instead of defending against external threats. Stage 8 is total systems collapse. The currency becomes worthless. Trade networks disintegrate. Cities are abandoned as populations flee to rural areas for survival. Knowledge is lost as libraries burn and schools close. The infrastructure that took centuries to build crumbles within decades. What had been civilization reverts to tribalism. Rome's final collapse in 476 AD wasn't caused by barbarian invasion. It was caused by internal systemic failure that made defense impossible. The Goths, Vandals, and Huns didn't conquer a strong empire. They occupied the ruins of a civilization that had already destroyed itself through the exact same 8-stage sequence. The British Empire followed the identical pattern 15 centuries later. Military overextension through 2 world wars. Currency debasement after abandoning the gold standard. Debt spiral from war borrowing. Loss of productive capacity to cheaper producers. Social decay through loss of imperial confidence. Military collapse through inability to defend territories. Political fragmentation through decolonization. And finally, total systems collapse from global superpower to regional European nation within 20 years. Years. The Soviet Union completed the same 8 stages in even less time. By 1945, the USSR emerged from World War II as a nuclear superpower, controlling Eastern Europe and influencing global politics. Within 46 years it had ceased to exist, not through military defeat or foreign invasion, but through the exact same internal collapse sequence that destroyed Rome and Britain. Stage 1 began immediately after 1945. Soviet military commitments spanned 11 time zones. Troops in East Germany, naval bases in Cuba, advisors in Vietnam, proxy wars in Africa, the invasion of Afghanistan. The Red Army maintained 5 million active personnel plus reserves. Nuclear weapons programs consumed massive resources. Space programs designed to demonstrate Soviet technological superiority. All of it funded by an economy a fraction the size of America's. The numbers were staggering. Military spending consumed between 15 and 25% of Soviet GDP. Compare that to America's current 4% and you understand the burden. But Soviet leadership believed military strength projected power and legitimacy. They convinced themselves that matching American capabilities was essential for survival, even when it meant sacrificing economic development. Stage 2 hit the Soviet economy through monetary manipulation disguised as central planning. The ruble wasn't freely convertible, but its purchasing power collapsed anyway. Soviet citizens watched prices rise while wages stagnated. Store shelves emptied as production quotas failed to meet demand. Black markets flourished because official markets couldn't provide basic goods. The government printed more rubles to fund operations, but printing money doesn't create wealth. It only redistributes it from savers to spenders, from citizens to state. By the 1970s, Stage 3 was accelerating. The Soviet Union borrowed heavily from Western banks to fund grain imports because their agricultural system had failed. They borrowed to buy consumer goods because their manufacturing couldn't satisfy domestic demand. They borrowed to maintain military spending because tax revenue couldn't cover costs. Each loan required repayment in hard currency, dollars or gold, which the Soviet Union earned primarily through oil exports. When oil prices dropped in the 1980s, the debt spiral became mathematically impossible to escape. Stage 4 destroyed Soviet productive capacity through systematic economic mismanagement. Central planning created perverse incentives where factories produced quantity over quality, where innovation was discouraged because it disrupted quotas, where resources were allocated by bureaucrats rather than market signals. Soviet factories produced goods nobody wanted while failing to produce goods everybody needed. The economy became a massive wealth destruction machine disguised as industrial policy. Meanwhile, the West was experiencing unprecedented technological advancement. Personal computers, telecommunications, biotechnology, materials science. The Soviet Union fell further behind each year because their system couldn't adapt to rapid change. Innovation requires risk-taking, experimentation, failure, and iteration. Central planning requires predictability, control, conformity, and stability. The two approaches are fundamentally incompatible. Stage 5 manifested through social disintegration that became visible by the 1980s. Alcoholism rates skyrocketed as citizens sought escape from economic reality. Life expectancy declined, unprecedented for a developed nation during peacetime. Crime increased despite harsh penalties. Political jokes spread faster than government propaganda. Citizens stopped believing in communist ideology, not because they embraced capitalism, but because the system obviously wasn't working. The most dangerous symptom was the loss of faith among elites themselves. Communist Party members began sending their children to Western universities. Government officials started moving money to Western banks. Even KGB officers began questioning whether the Soviet system could survive. When the people running the system stop believing in it, collapse becomes inevitable. Stage 6 arrived when the military could no longer fulfill its basic functions. The Afghanistan War, which began in 1979, became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. 10 years of fighting against guerrillas armed with American weapons produced nothing but casualties and debt. Young men refused military service. Officers sold equipment to buy food. Entire units abandoned their positions. The military that had liberated Berlin and intimidated NATO became a hollow shell maintained through conscription and coercion. Nuclear weapons provided the illusion of strength, but nuclear weapons can't maintain empire. They can't suppress domestic rebellion. They can't force economic productivity. They can't create legitimacy. The Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear warheads to destroy civilization, but couldn't prevent its own citizens from losing faith in their government. Stage 7 began in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and accelerated through 1991. Eastern European satellites rejected Soviet control within months. The Baltic states declared independence. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and other republics demanded autonomy. The central government in Moscow found itself ruling an increasingly small territory, as peripheral regions simply stopped recognizing Soviet authority. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost and perestroika, intended to save the system, actually accelerated its collapse. Opening political discussion revealed how deeply citizens resented communist rule. Economic restructuring exposed how inefficient the system had become. Transparency destroyed the mystique that had kept the regime in power. Good intentions couldn't reverse 40 years of systemic decay. Stage 8 culminated on December 25, 1991, when Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 separate nations emerged from what had been a single superpower. The ruble became worthless overnight. State enterprises collapsed, leaving millions unemployed. Infrastructure deteriorated as maintenance stopped. Social services disappeared as funding evaporated. Life savings vanished as hyperinflation destroyed purchasing power. But here's the critical detail most Americans miss. The Soviet collapse wasn't gradual. It was sudden. In 1985, the USSR looked stable to outside observers. By 1991, it had ceased to exist. 6 years from apparent stability to complete dissolution. The acceleration happened because each stage reinforced the others. Military overextension created fiscal pressure. Currency debasement destroyed savings. Debt spiral eliminated options. Loss of productivity reduced revenue. Social decay undermined legitimacy. Military collapse removed enforcement capability. Political fragmentation ended central control. The same mathematical sequence is now playing out in the United States, and we're much further along than most people realize. America has completed 7 of the 8 stages. We're not approaching collapse. We're already in the final phase. Stage 1 is obvious to anyone paying attention. American military commitments span the globe. 800 military bases in 80 countries. Troops in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Niger, and dozens of other locations. Naval patrols in the South China Sea, Persian Gulf, and Mediterranean. Military spending of $850 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. And it's not enough. We can't simultaneously contain China, deter Russia, fight terrorism, defend allies, and maintain global hegemony. The mathematics of overextension make this impossible. This impossible. Stage 2 is already complete and accelerating. The dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. But the real debasement began in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window, making the dollar pure fiat currency backed by nothing but government promises. Since 2000, the money supply has expanded by over 400%. Since 2020, we've printed more than $6 trillion, increasing the monetary base by 40% in just 4 years. The mechanism is different from Roman silver debasement, but the result is identical. Wealth transfers from savers to debtors, from workers to asset holders, from the productive economy to the financial system. Every dollar printed reduces the value of dollars already in circulation. The government funds operations by stealing purchasing power from citizens who don't understand what's happening to them. Stage 3 is mathematically undeniable. The United States owes $37 trillion in official debt. That's 132% of GDP, higher than any time in American history except World War II. But unlike World War II, this debt wasn't accumulated fighting existential threats. It was accumulated funding consumption, welfare programs, bureaucratic expansion, and foreign interventions that produced no measurable benefits. Interest payments alone now exceed $880 billion annually. More than defense spending, more than Medicare, more than anything except Social Security. And interest rates remain historically elevated. If rates stay at 5%, interest payments will consume $1.8 trillion by 2027. That's 6% of GDP just for interest. Not principal repayment, not new spending, just interest on existing debt. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt will reach $54 trillion by 2034. At that level, interest payments would exceed $2 trillion annually, consuming nearly half of federal revenue. There is no mathematical scenario where this trajectory ends without crisis. You cannot tax your way out when the wealthy control policy. You cannot grow your way out when debt grows faster than the economy. You cannot cut spending enough when interest alone consumes a quarter of the budget. Stage 4 is destroying American productive capacity exactly as it destroyed Rome's. We import 800 billion more than we export annually. Manufacturing has been outsourced to China, Mexico, Vietnam, anywhere labour costs less than American workers demand. We design products, finance purchases, and consume goods, but we don't make things anymore. The supply chain vulnerabilities became obvious during COVID when we couldn't produce basic medical supplies in our own country. Masks, ventilators, pharmaceuticals, all imported from nations that could shut off supply whenever convenient. We discovered that most pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. Most rare earth minerals come from China. Most electronics manufacturing happens in China. We've made ourselves dependent on a strategic competitor for survival necessities, but the deeper problem is human capital flight. American students avoid engineering and manufacturing in favour of finance and consulting. The best minds go to Wall Street to manipulate money rather than build things. We import foreign workers for technology jobs because Americans can't or won't do the work. Innovation is migrating to countries that reward productive activity instead of financial speculation. Stage 5 is visible everywhere if you're willing to see it. Trust in institutions has collapsed to historic lows. 15% of Americans trust Congress. 30% trust the Supreme Court. 40% trust the presidency. Half the country believes elections are rigged. The other half believes January 6th was an insurrection. Neither side trusts the other's legitimacy. Social cohesion is disintegrating along racial, cultural, and ideological lines. Cities are becoming unlivable as crime explodes and businesses flee. San Francisco, once a symbol of American prosperity, is now known for homelessness, drug addiction, and retail theft. Seattle, Portland, Chicago, New York, all experiencing population flight as residents escape dysfunction that local governments can't or won't address. The symptoms are everywhere. Declining birth rates below replacement level, rising suicide rates among young people, drug overdoses killing over 100,000 Americans annually, mass shootings so frequent they barely register in news cycles, political violence increasing as democratic norms erode. This isn't temporary social tension. This is civilizational decay accelerating toward complete breakdown. Stage 6 is beginning as military recruitment fails and equipment deteriorates. The Army missed its recruitment targets by 15,000 soldiers in 2023. The Navy is decommissioning ships faster than it builds new ones. The Air Force is flying aircraft older than their pilots. Maintenance backlogs grow as budgets shift from readiness to personnel costs and social programs. But the real crisis is loss of military effectiveness. 20 years in Afghanistan ended with humiliating withdrawal and Taliban victory. Iraq remains unstable despite massive investment. Syria is controlled by Russian and Iranian forces. China builds military capability faster than America can respond. Russia demonstrates that American weapons systems can be defeated by determined opponents with inferior technology. The volunteer military model is breaking down as young Americans reject service in institutions they don't trust, fighting wars they don't understand for objectives nobody can explain. When military service becomes something to avoid rather than honor, imperial defense becomes impossible regardless of spending levels. Stage 7 is accelerating through political fragmentation disguised as federalism. States are refusing to enforce federal laws they disagree with. Immigration, drug policy, gun control, election procedures, all becoming matters of state discretion rather than federal authority. The Constitution becomes a suggestion rather than supreme law, as different regions interpret it according to local preferences. Texas talks about secession. California acts as an independent nation in international climate negotiations. Florida ignores federal COVID policies. New York defies federal immigration enforcement. The United States is becoming a confederation of autonomous regions that happen to share a currency and military, exactly how the Roman Empire fragmented before final collapse. The Supreme Court's authority erodes as states ignore decisions they dislike. Executive orders become meaningless when governors refuse compliance. Congressional legislation becomes unenforceable when half the states consider federal power illegitimate. We're not witnessing political polarization. We're witnessing the dissolution of national authority that precedes systemic collapse. Stage 8 approaches as all previous stages converge into a self-reinforcing crisis that no institution can control. The mathematics are inexorable. Debt growing faster than the economy, currency losing purchasing power accelerating, military commitments exceeding capacity, social trust collapsing, political authority fragmenting. History shows that Stage 8 happens suddenly, not gradually. The Soviet Union looked stable in 1985 and disappeared by 1991. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world in 1945 and lost it by 1970. Rome seemed eternal until barbarians occupied the capital. The pattern repeats because the underlying forces are mathematical, not political. When Stage 8 arrives, it won't be announced or predicted by mainstream institutions. It will manifest as cascade failure where each system collapse triggers others. Currency crisis leads to supply chain breakdown. Supply chain breakdown leads to social unrest. Social unrest leads to political paralysis. Political paralysis leads to military intervention or foreign exploitation. The speed of modern communication and financial markets means American collapse will happen faster than historical precedents. Digital currency can become worthless overnight. Supply chains can break within days. Social media can coordinate massive protests within hours. The infrastructure that makes modern life possible operates on trust and confidence that can evaporate instantly when people realize the system is failing. Understanding where we are in this sequence isn't about politics or ideology. It's about mathematics and history. The pattern has repeated for 2,000 years across different cultures, political systems and technological levels. Every empire believes it's different. Every empire believes it's too advanced to fail. Every empire follows the same 8 stages from expansion to collapse. America is not exceptional. We are not immune to historical forces that destroyed every previous superpower. The same mathematics that bankrupted Rome are bankrupting us. The same overextension that fragmented the British Empire is fragmenting our global presence. The same loss of productive capacity that hollowed out the Soviet Union is hollowing out our economy. Union is hollowing out our economy. The question isn't whether America will follow the 8-stage collapse formula. The question is how fast we'll complete it. Rome took 4 centuries. Britain took 40 years. The Soviet Union took 26 years. We've compressed 7 stages into less than 50 years, and we're accelerating. Maybe we'll find a way to break the pattern. Maybe American ingenuity will solve problems that destroyed every previous superpower. Maybe technology will overcome mathematics. Maybe democracy will triumph over history. But the formula doesn't care about hope. The formula cares about numbers, and the numbers say Stage 8 is coming. 3 empires fell following this exact sequence. Each time, the people in power never saw it coming. Each time, citizens thought their civilization was too advanced to collapse. Each time, they learned that no empire is permanent, no currency lasts forever, and no political system survives the mathematics of overextension and decay. If this changed how you see where America stands in the historical cycle, subscribe. Because when Stage 8 begins, you'll want to understand what's happening and why. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past, repeated across centuries, playing out again right now. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and we're hearing the same rhythm that echoed through Rome, London, and Moscow before us.